We will never turn our back on a single Scot.
We've got to wrestle with those challenges.
This is our country. Let's fix it together.
I was furious to hear about these things.
Hello and welcome to another Planet Holyrood. I'm Paul Hutcheon, political editor of the Daily Record. I'm joined this week by the Sunday Mail's political editor John Ferguson and also Ben Borland, who's the Scottish Daily Express's editor. So this week we're going to look back at Labour conference in Liverpool. John and I were both there. It involved a lot of work and a little bit of drinking, but obviously that was all in the line of duty. I think it'd be fair to say that Labour gathered in Liverpool against a pretty troubled backdrop. You had the row, which is still ongoing, about cuts to the winter fuel payment for millions of elderly people. There's the row over freebies for Keir Starmer, Angela Rayner, Rachel Reeves over clothes, glasses, football. These rows continue to linger. And so I think the aim of the conference was effectively to change the narrative, change the tone. Because frankly, over the last few weeks, we've had a miserable message coming out of Downing Street, effectively that things are going to get worse, that it's going to be a horror budget. So Reeves and Starmer were searching for a gear change. And I think that the Prime Minister's speech was very much in the context of there's going to be short-term pain, but it's for long-term gain. There's going to be a better society, stronger public services, a growing economy at the end of this process. And I don't know what you both think, but I sense that he pulled it off just.
Yeah, so I mean, I think that's true. There was clearly a lot of effort going into changing the messaging, and that this conference going into it, we had, I think it was just this terrible combination of a fairly lackluster sounding policy platform and this relentless message about, you know, things can only get worse. And then on top of that, you layer all of the accusations about freebies and conflicts of interest, and it was all adding up to something pretty toxic and damaging for Labour. And it's pretty clear that they've gone into this to try to change the public's view on what they're all about in government. And I think you could see that coming through in Keir Starmer's speech and Rachel Reeves' speech. They wanted to strike a more positive tone with the public. And I think they certainly managed that in terms of the message, but I don't think there was necessarily much in terms of new policy announcements that might actually give people that hope for the future that they want to instill. And I mean, I also, you know, I mean, perhaps they moved on a little bit from the rows over freebies and all the rest of it, but I don't, certainly I'm looking at my social media and in today's world where, you know, you see a sort of 1 minute clip of whatever political journalists are asking the Prime Minister about in interviews, and the ones that I'm seeing again and again are where he's been questioned about freebies, about football tickets, about stays in penthouse apartments. So I think it is proving quite difficult for them to turn the page in this. I don't think they seem to quite. A lot of the messaging before the election was this idea that the Tories were very corrupt and untrustworthy, and all the cronyism was something that was going to change for good with Labour. And I don't think that they quite get that, even though they don't believe this is the same thing, that actually in the eyes of the public, it just is. They just don't think that politicians that get paid six-figure salaries should be taking free tickets to football matches and accepting free suits and staying in expensive London apartments. They just don't think it's right. So I think it's proven difficult to move on. And like you mentioned earlier, the real test now is this looming budget.
I think the other story that certainly Express readers are very worried about. I mean, clearly people are angry about Donegate and they're angry about the freebies. But for me, I think the biggest setback for Labour at the conference was the vote on reversing the winter fuel payment cut. I don't know about you guys. It feels like it's winter's here. The last couple of days have turned quite cold. I've actually got my central heating on today. I imagine that other people across Scotland will have as well, but there'll be, sadly, almost 1 million pensioners who are probably thinking, can I afford to switch on my central heating this winter? They certainly won't be having it on when it starts to get chilly at the end of September. I think, Donagate, while it's annoying the public and it's certainly a good talker and there's loads of detail and colourful stories about 40th birthday parties and free glasses and designer suits, when we get into the heart of winter, and particularly a Scottish winter, the winter fuel payment is going to turn out to be I see it as one of the biggest mistakes ever made by an incoming prime minister. It's a catastrophe for Labour, and it's only going to get worse as the weather gets worse and people struggle to put on their heating. And really, he should spend the political capital he's got from his landslide victory and admit he was wrong and reverse this decision. Do what the conference has told him to do. Do what the unions have told him to do. Do what MPs are telling him to do. Do what the campaign groups are telling him to do. Reverse this decision. Looking back, that's going to be, I think, what comes out of this conference.
I think Donagate makes it harder for them as well, because the last couple of months have all been in the context of you've got to tighten your belts. You've got to make sacrifices because the Tories have wrecked the economy, and particularly you, the pensioners, we're going to take £300 off you. And then at the same time, the same cabinet ministers are raking in freebies, designer clothes and football junkets, whatnot. Just it plays into this perception of it's one rule for politicians and one rule for everyone else. And that's corrosive for the Labour government, but it's corrosive for politics more widely. And I think they've made this sort of pain narrative much harder now for themselves than it ought to have been. I mean, clearly, if there'd never been a single story on freebies or hospitality, the winter fuel payment story cut would have been extremely difficult for them. And it doesn't take a genius to work out the headlines they're going to get in December, January, when old folk are going to end up in A&E because they can't afford to switch on their heating. But I feel like, the first 100 days of a government, that's when you really want to set the tone and a positive mood of change like the Blair government did in 1997. And he's never going to get another 100 days, first 100 days. And there is a sense it's a big waste for Labour.
Yeah, I think that's right. And Ben, I think it's true in terms of what impacts people. The winter fuel payments is going to be felt in a real way for a lot of pensioners. But I do think that you can't underestimate just how much things like free suits and glasses and football tickets does resonate with the public. In very much the same way, if you remember the furore over Boris Johnson's wallpaper, in a way it's kind of easier for people to identify with why that's wrong, more so in many ways than billions of pounds in COVID contracts. It's like sort of sums that people can understand. And yeah, I think it's that contrast of they are taking £1,000 suits off of donors while taking £300 away from some of the poorest people in society. It's that juxtaposition that is really going to hurt them. And it's interesting you mentioned the vote. There's another story just breaking this morning that I've been looking at. There's a couple of pensioners from Coatbridge who are now taking legal action against both the UK and Scottish government with the help of the Govan Law Centre on this. And I've read a bit of the detail on it, and it looks like a really interesting case. The legal basis is the idea that the Scottish and UK governments haven't done the legally required due diligence on the policy before they've introduced it as an emergency measure. Of course, if Labour were to do the due diligence on this in terms of studies to find out what the impact would be, how many people will possibly die, then they're possibly going to have to revert to their own study from a few years ago, where I think was it 4,000 people that they estimated could die. So, I mean, that's one to watch. It would be a huge embarrassment if the government is found not to have actually gone through the correct legal steps, given that the Prime Minister is himself a lawyer. And if that was to potentially lead to this policy having to be reversed or changed retrospectively.
So 2 pensions from Coke Bridge.
Yeah, that's right.
I'd seen there was a legal challenge. I hadn't realised they were Scots. Oh, that's great. Well done.
Yeah.
I mean, John, I said earlier that you and I were both at the conference. We were part of the Scottish lobby, and inevitably a lot of our focus, a lot of our chats were about what is this rocky start by Keir Starmer going to do for Anas Sarwar's chances in the next Holyrood election in 2026. And it's clear from talking to people in Team Scottish Labour that Anas Sarwar hasn't exactly been hugely happy with elements of the first couple of months, particularly Keir Starmer's Rose Garden speech and that famous line about things are going to get worse. And I think, I can't remember the exact phrase, but it was quite a pointed section in Anas's conference speech about things will get better or can get better. Doesn't take a genius to work out what he was trying to say there. I sense that Anas and his team were more content, more upbeat by the end of the conference, because they felt like there was a concerted attempt to change the record and project a more optimistic and upbeat tone.
Yeah, I think they'll certainly be hoping that that's going to be the direction of travel from here on in. I think it's probably a reasonable assumption that that UK Labour do want to front load a bit of the pain here, get the nasty stuff out of the way early, and then try to sort of point towards the sunny uplands a bit more as we go forward. I mean, for example, the budget's going to be really interesting. I suspect that you're beginning to see hints of what it's going to look like today with this story that Rachel Reeves is trying to convince the OBR to sort of open up a bit of headroom for spending via better economic outlook stats as a result of the policies they have around doing away with some of the planning regulations that we have at the moment. I suspect there's probably going to be some pain in it, but also some good news as well, and then quite a lot of clever accounting in the background to make it, to try to deliver something that is not going to be a horror show for people. And so I think, Anas is just going to be hoping that the direction of travel is now going to be changing, and that there is going to be a much more positive outlook, because it's potentially pretty cataclysmic for him, isn't it? If things, the biggest risk to his chances of becoming First Minister at the moment is what Keir Starmer and the UK wing of his party do in Westminster. I mean, in terms of how the next couple or the next year and a half will play out, I think that there undoubtedly will be obstacles for Labour. There's going to be problems, there's going to be negative stories, but there's going to be negative stories for the SNP as well. You've got this whole branch form investigation coming down the road. You've got there's 3 or 4 things that are potentially huge banana skins. So I think that you have to remember that both parties aren't going to have a particularly great run into 2026.
I just think, I guess it's what's the timeline that Labour have got here? Clearly, the strategy is, like you say, front load the pain, take the hits, and then by the next UK election, things are looking up. But have they thought at all about trying to get the bounce back in time for 2026? To me, the whole strategy is just insane. I've never known a political party, a government to be so downbeat about what it's doing and to actually tell people things are going to get worse. I mean, it's just, even if the strategy is that we get a big bounce back, why do that? It's like a football manager coming in and saying, well, we're going to probably get relegated next season, but in 5 years' time, we might be back at the top of the league. It's such a odd strategy. I mean, maybe I don't understand the how big the bounce back is going to be, but I just don't understand it at all. And
well, I think that even though there was a clear attempt at being more optimistic, I think that Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves still see the next few months as about the frame of the next election. So if you think back to when Cameron and Osborne got in back in 2010, they just hammered Labour on the economy, saying that they'd wreck the country, that you can't trust Labour with your cash. A sort of variation of Mrs. Thatcher back in 79 in the winter of discontent, playing into Labour's weaknesses. And I think that Reeves and Starmer are basically trying to do to the Tories what previous Conservative administrations have done to them. The problem with that is that it's just sort of prolonging the misery and the sacrifice narrative, and people are just desperate to turn the corner on that. And of course, it also means that Scottish Labour and UK Labour are out of sync. So while you've got Reeves and Starmer wanting to sort of frame the next election, the next Westminster election, Anas is thinking about 2026, and he wants, a lot more optimism. So they're not really gelling well just now.
And just to pick up on the Tory point, obviously there's the famous note that from the Treasury that there's no more money, or we've spent all the money. But I get that. So you frame it as the economy and the country are in a terrible state, but now we're in charge, things get better. Whereas Labour have come in and said the economy and the country are actually, what they've had to do is because people think, do you know what? And I've made this point on this podcast multiple times, Jeremy Hunt and Rishi Sunak were turning the corner. Things were looking up. Inflation was back down to target levels. The economy was on the up. And most people, I think, would have agreed with that. So what Starmer and Reeves have had to do is say, actually, that's not true. The economy was terrible. The country's in a terrible state. And then the extraordinary thing is they say, and we're going to make it worse for a while. It's just the whole we're going to make things worse narrative. I just do not get. I don't get it.
I mean, there was a really interesting story last week about how potentially what the Prime Minister said in the Rose Garden that day is having a real world impact on consumer confidence and business confidence, and that that's a very interesting thing, that this, by saying things are going to get worse, potentially a government can make things worse, because consumers start thinking, oh, right, well, if he's telling me that, then I'm not going to be spending any money, and businesses are thinking, right, this isn't the time to invest. So I think it should be a lesson for the Prime Minister that his words have an impact. And I mean, in terms of, I think they wanted to front load pain, but at the same time, as you said earlier, Paul, that you don't get another 100 days. And those first 100 days have, you can talk about the mess that's been made, but you also need to say, but now we are here, things are going to get better, here's what we're going to do. What's happened to the pay rise that millions of workers were supposed to be getting? I mean, I'm sure these things are still happening, but they just need to start talking about them a bit more. And I think the issue is that I don't really think, and certainly speaking to Scottish Labour MPs at the conference, I don't think that Keir Starmer really is thinking too much about the Scottish election in 2026 is the brutal truth. And I don't, the impression I got from MPs I was speaking to is that they don't necessarily think that he's thinking about it that much either. It's not, he's aware of it, but I don't think that his top priority is necessarily getting an Sarwar into Butte House I think he wants it, and he'll be very happy if it happens. But I don't think he's going to be shaping UK policy and UK policy announcements around that election. I mean, to be honest, I don't see how he really can.
It has to be pointed out as well that opinion polls have shown Scottish Labour going down since July the 4th. And also there was an opinion poll in one of the papers this morning which showed that people's faith in Scottish Labour to turn around key public services is also down compared to previous polling. So the performance of the Labour government has had an impact on the Scottish Party, and a negative one. And, you know, I still think Anas is probably favourite to be the next First Minister, but it could be very close. And he doesn't really just want to sneak over the line, because you could end up with a situation where he becomes First Minister with 38, 39, 40 seats in a completely unmanageable parliament that has a sizable reform contingent. So you could end up being First Minister, someone who's in office but doesn't have much power.
Yeah, I think that's exactly the risk. And then you start thinking, so what are the deals that can be done to form a government that can have a workable policy platform? And that's where the suggestions we had last week about potentially should the SNP and Labour be growing up and accepting that they're virtually the same party apart from their view on the constitution, and thinking about whether there's some way of them working together. I don't think it will happen because they hate each other, but it does seem like you could end up in a situation where it was potentially the only workable, viable coalition.
Yeah, I mean, I think reform is going to be an interesting one. I mean, it's a party that is barely broken sweat in Scotland, yet they outpolled the Scottish Tories in a lot of seats in July. And you just think that if they make an effort, they could break through in most of the regions of the Scottish Parliament election. That would completely hamper or hamstring the Scottish Tories. And I mean, I don't know what it does for governance in the Scottish Parliament, because I don't think they'd be in any rush to help either a Labour government or an SNP government.
I think it might be interesting if Reform, and they've flirted with this idea before, actually stood on a platform of abolishing the Scottish Parliament and kind of putting the power back in the hands of the Scotland Office and the UK government. I honestly believe that is a much more widely held view in Scotland than most people think it is.
Yeah, it's held by complete bambots.
Obviously, it's a minority view. I would say a good quarter of the country would happily abolish Holyrood.
No way.
So?
No. Yeah, I think so.
I think it's a fringe Bampot view, but I mean, if some folk want to vote for a party on that basis, then that's their democratic right.
I think the Reform, I mean, last time round it would appear they did quite well in Scotland, and half of their candidates allegedly didn't even exist as real people. So it does make you worry what they might be able to do if they field real candidates.
All right, I think that probably wraps it up. This time next week, we will, of course, have a new Scottish Conservative leader. We'll find the identity of that individual tomorrow. It's going to be either Russell Findlay, Megan Gallagher, or Murdo Fraser. My money would probably be on Russell Findlay. I'm not sure what the pair of you think.
I think I would go for Russell as well. Being a former Sunday Mail journalist, I feel like I need to have some type of allegiance, even though I don't have any to the Tory party. I'll put my money on Russell with you, Paul.
Yeah, agreed. I think Russell Findlay's probably the favourite. I also think he's probably the leader who can most effectively combat the rise of reform, which is probably the Scots Tories' main concern at the moment, given he's kind of, he's more combative, I think, although Megan and Murdo, I'm sure, are equally good in a verbal joust. But I think, my money will be on Russell as well.
I think they're screwed regardless. A combination of natural slippage and also the presence of reform. I think it's going to be a difficult Holyrood election for the Scottish Tories, but time will tell. So thanks again to John and to Ben for joining us on this episode. Please tune in again next week.
We will never turn our back on a single Scot.
We've got to wrestle with those challenges.
This is our country. Let's fix it together.
I was furious to hear about these things.